You're about to watch a trial for high treason, the sentence for which is death. The year is 1779. 3 years earlier, on the 4th of July 1776, the American colonies rebelled against Britain. Perhaps it was a protest against British taxes, a sort of huge poll tax riot. Perhaps, as the Declaration of Independence said, it was because they wanted a new society where everyone was created equal. To the government in England, it was a lawless mutiny. It'll be another 4 years before the peace treaty ending the Revolutionary War of Independence is signed. But today, in 1779, George Washington, General of the Continental Army and founding father of the United States of America, has voluntarily come to London to answer the charge of treason against the King. Of course, George Washington never really came to London to stand trial for treason, but in this trial you will see what might have happened if he had. What you're about to see is a real trial conducted by real barristers in front of real judges. George Washington and the other witnesses are played by experts in historical interpretation, but there is no script. Unlike Rumpole, you will see this trial live and unrehearsed. The prosecution is led by the eminent South African Queen's Counsel, Sidney Kentridge, the man who conducted Steve Biko's appeal and defended the Sharpeville Six. The defense is in the hands of a team of American lawyers. Neither side, nor the witnesses, know what will happen next. So, silence in court. They're about to bring up the defendant.
You are charged with high treason contrary to the Treason Act 1351, in that you, George Washington, in June 1775, accepted command of an army of rebellion, and from that time levied war upon the King in his realm. George Washington, how do you plead?
To the charge, not guilty.
I repeat, not guilty. Will you be seated?
My lords, the essential facts of the case are simple. The defendant, whom I shall call General George Washington of the colony of Virginia, is charged with levying war against His Majesty. On the 16th of June 1775, the defendant accepted appointment as General and Commander-in-Chief of the so-called Continental Army, the very purpose of which was to oppose His Majesty's forces and to oppose His Majesty's government. My lord, given the admitted facts, what defense can there be? It's believed by the Crown that the defense that will be raised, my lords, is threefold. First, that there is a right to revolt against oppression. Secondly, that the King himself provoked the revolt by his measures against the colonies. And thirdly, that the King breached what the defense says is a compact between the King and his subjects, in that he denied them the rights and liberties of British subjects. Our submission, however, is that both in fact and in law, these defenses are bad. My lord, it is true that Blackstone has said that whereas resistance is not justified in the case of private grievance, nonetheless, in the case of national oppression, the nation has very justifiably risen as one man to vindicate the original contract subsisting between the king and his people. Here, my lord, it will be my submission that we have no case of national oppression. To say that the rebels have risen as one man is to forget the 500,000 loyal subjects of His Majesty still in the American colonies. Now, my lord, we all know what real oppression is. We simply have to look across the channel to see that. One may understand that the subjects of the Tsar of Russia are oppressed, and those too of the King of France, with whom, my lords, your lordships will not overlook, only a year ago, these American lovers of liberty entered into an alliance. My lord, have the colonists suffered oppression? Their religion is not suppressed. They had their own assemblies until these themselves became rebellious. No American has been arbitrarily executed. My lord, they complain of taxes. Everyone complains of taxes. But are unfair taxes a ground of revolt? May I put a hypothetical case, my lord? Supposing in the far distant future, in these very islands, some British government were to impose a new and unpopular tax, let us say a poll tax.
That's an absurd example to take something like that, Mr. Kentridge.
Well, I beg your lordship's pardon, but surely if such absurdity did arise, that would be no excuse for rebellion. My lord, it is said that the colonists are not represented in Parliament. Not directly indeed, but their case is constantly presented with great vigour and skill in the House of Commons and the Lords. And my lord, in this year of 1779, there are many places in England not represented in Parliament. We all know that the cities of Birmingham, Manchester and Sheffield have no members of Parliament. May they revolt? May any court recognise their right to revolt against their taxation? Now, my lord, let me not put my case too strongly. The fortitude and the dignity in adversity of General Washington we do not question. The war is in progress, and for all that we in this court know, General Washington and his forces may succeed in that war, and future generations, even in this country, may judge him generously. Your lordships will remember what Sir John Harrington said, "Treason doth never prosper. What's the reason? If it prosper, none dare call it treason." And if General Washington's forces prosper, he may come to be regarded not as a traitor, but as a hero. But that judgment, my lords, must be left to history. It is not the judgment that is possible to this court.
Thank you, Mr. Kentridge. Lords, General Washington pleads not guilty to the indictment. The defense, Your Honor, is not as trivial as has been presented by my learned friend. The defense, Your Honor, is the right of all peoples to liberty, to the right of all peoples to choose by whom they will be represented and who will tax them. And the law, Your Honor, is the law of this country. General Washington defends himself by suggesting to the court that there has been a pattern of arrogance and a pattern of war established by the throne that requires a nation to defend itself.
Was this following the destruction of some tea which had been brought to Boston by the East India Company, Mr. Braff? I think it was.
Yes,
known,
sir,
I believe, colloquially as the Boston Tea Party.
The destruction of the tea, my lord, was symbolic. The destruction of the T merely said, please, please, listen to us. Hear our plea. The sadness of this is that so many opportunities arose and went for these problems to have been resolved, to have been solved. But they never were. Petition after petition, right after right, was not heard. Had there been one moment in which the parties sat down, this defendant and his kin in our country would not have taken the moves we have taken. Your Honor, this defendant is guilty of no crime but defending himself and his nation. Our country, established years ago under the flag of the British, is entitled to the same freedoms that the Crown affords to people here. And if it is your honor, we urge that this defendant be found innocent.
Thank you, Mr. Braff. Now, Mr. Kentridge.
Lord, I call the first Lord of the Treasury, the Right Honourable Lord North.
Old Lord North. Lord North, would you hold the testament in your right hand and repeat after me, please? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Now, Lord North, you have, I think, since 1770 been First Lord of the Treasury and as such His Majesty's First Minister.
Indeed, yes.
And you have taken upon yourself the prime responsibility under the Crown for British policy towards the North American colonies.
Indeed.
What are the mainsprings of your policy towards the colonies?
The principal issues which we are trying to uphold are really twofold. One is the entirely pragmatic issue of securing from those colonists who are getting an extraordinarily favorable deal by membership of a beneficent and highly prosperous empire. We're trying to secure some small contribution to the really substantial costs of defense.
Now, Lord North, what are the costs to this country of the defense of the American colonies
Well,
per year?
when we started, we estimated in Cabinet that the cost would be about £200,000 a year, the defense of the American colonies. And we tried to secure, in the financial legislation of that year, a contribution of around £60,000. £60,000 out of £200,000 in a budget
Act?
which is about £7 million.
Was that through the Stamp Act?
Yes.
Out of a budget, you say, of some $7 million. Has this country, to your knowledge, during your time and before, when you served in government, withheld protection from the American colonies?
No, quite the reverse. We stationed 15 regiments in North America after the war to try to ensure that there was stability on the frontier, a very dangerous frontier, where there had been a recent Indian rising in 1763 with 2,000 colonists killed.
Was that the rising of Pontiac?
That was indeed the case.
Well, in that case, did the American colonists themselves defend themselves against Pontiac, or was it British troops?
It was extremely difficult to secure assistance from the colonists.
And do you know how many troops, for example, New York sent to defend itself against Pontiac?
Well below the quota asked. We asked for 1,400, I beg your pardon, they raised 300. In other words, a piffling number.
Lord North, if I may come to a slightly different topic. We are told, as I've said, that you are attempting to reduce the colonies to slavery During the, let us say, the last 15 years, has there been an influx of new settlers into the American colonies from England and elsewhere in Europe?
During the period 1760 to 1775, there has been approximately 221,000 immigrants into the colonies. The colonies have enjoyed enormous prosperity, and rough estimates suggest that something like 1 person in the colonies out of 10 had entered the colonies between 1760 and 1775. In other words, hardly people flocking to an area which they saw as being under tyrannical rule.
Yes. And Lord North, it has been said that you are depriving the American colonists of the rights of Englishmen. Are you conscious of having deprived them of their freedoms?
There have been some temporary suspensions of colonial assemblies, but one must remember that the imperial parliament reserves to its right ultimate supremacy, ultimate superiority, and that is the principal constitutional issue at stake. And the colonial assemblies, it has to be stressed, provide for American colonies much, much wider liberties than, and self-rule than the people, let us say, of Scotland enjoy, or Yorkshire enjoy, or of the county of Middlesex enjoy.
Well, we know there are no American members of Parliament, but are their views heard in the Commons and the Lords of this country?
Indeed, on major legislation, there are a number of MPs, much to my regret, who oppose the enlightened measures taken by my ministry.
Yes. And I wonder if I could deal, Lord North, with the question of taxation. We've heard the cry of no taxation without representation. But we know there are many places in England which have no direct representation in the Commons. Does the British Constitution in that respect nonetheless command general satisfaction?
Certainly, yes. There are a number of cities which have no direct, no MPs, and yet abide by the decisions of Parliament.
What about the punishment visited by the government on the city of Boston? Is that justified?
Well, the city of Boston was a center of radicalism from 1765. There was really mob rule on occasions in Boston.
A final point, Lord North. You have heard learned counsel who opened the case for the defendant express regret that the voice of Americans had not been heard, that you had not engaged in dialogue with the Americans. What have you to say to that charge?
You cannot have dialogue under intimidation. We have said this repeatedly. You cannot have dialogue with people who riot in the streets, attack government property, and simply do not come to order. So our view has been consistent. Respect for the absolute sovereignty of Parliament, and then we can think about things.
Yes. Well, thank you, Lord North.
Good evening, Lord North. When did you become a member of Parliament?
Gosh, so long ago, I've forgotten. I think it's 1754-ish.
You were about 22 years old?
Yeah.
And you were elected to Parliament, were you not?
I suppose so, yes.
You were.
Pretty small vote electorate, I thought.
And you were elected by your district, correct?
Yes.
And you've stayed in Parliament ever since 1754, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And you've risen to the lofty position of leader of the House of Commons, is that right?
Indeed.
And when did you become leader of the House of Commons?
1768 or 7, somewhere around there.
I thought he was in the House of Lords. Aren't you in the House of Lords?
No, my father, the Earl of Guildford, won't die. I mean, he's still alive. I hold a courtesy title, my lord.
And in 1767, you were appointed to Chancellor of the Exchequer, is that right?
Yes.
And that's made you part of the King's administration, part of his cabinet.
I am the King's Minister, sir.
And in 1770, you became the King's first minister, the Prime Minister of England, is that right?
Yes, indeed.
Let's step back for a moment. And let's focus on the time period between 1763 and 1774. And let's look at some of the things that you've said. In 1768, November 8th, in an address you made to the Parliament concerning the issue of, not an address to Parliament, a discussion in the ministry concerning the debate about the repeal of the Townshend duties, you declared, did you not, that you would not think of repealing the Townshend duties, quote, until you saw America prostrate at your feet, end quote.
I've also said I'm a friend to trade and a friend to America.
I'm sure you've said that. What we're talking about is what you have said against America and what you've done against America. And true to your words, you voted not to repeal the duty on tea after consideration of the repeal of the Townshend duties, correct?
Yes, indeed.
And in
1769, I think it was.
And in 1770, the issue was presented to Parliament. Is that right?
Yes, and we repealed a lot of other stuff. Yes, lead and glass and things like that.
But you kept the duty on tea. Is that right?
Yes, indeed. It raised £11,000.
There was a lot of complaints and protests from the colonies about the Townshend duties as a tax imposed upon the colonies without representation. Is that right?
There was a great deal of this sort of nonsense, and I think the key point which I would make about all those duties, which I made before, was really as a government we had a long-term financial problem. We had a large budget deficit, we had vast debts, and I was determined as Chancellor of the Exchequer, to ensure that over time the national debt would be kept under control. Americans may have other attitudes towards borrowing and borrowing and borrowing.
Yeah. We did. Excuse me.
We tried to keep the national debt down,
Lord
and
North.
I was determined. I was determined to raise a variety of taxes. Now, you've asked me about a tax, and I will not.
May I interrupt you, Lord North?
I really do object.
May I interrupt you, Lord North?
Certainly.
Will you remember that this is a court of law and not the House of Commons?
Well, I'm sorry, my lord. I spend so much time in the House. I have to.
So we noted.
I have to.
Would you try
carry
and
the burdens of the government?
Would you try?
Lord North, you refused to accept, and Parliament refused to accept petitions from the colonists protesting the repeal of such duties because they attacked the authority of Parliament to tax. Is that right?
Yes, the constitutional issue. If I may go on.
Will counsel please let Lord North finish his answer?
Yes.
Within limits before you interrupt her.
Yes.
Thank you, my lord. That's very gracious of you. But I do rather find these inane, silly questions rather absurd. I mean, the whole point is that we're dealing with a very difficult constitutional political setup. And what the government said at the time was that we wish to see the recognition of some fundamental constitutional guideline. That in any political order, in any society, you've got to have some basic law, and that law was supremacy of Parliament.
Once again, Lord North, could we be spared the speeches and confine ourselves to the answers to the questions?
Certainly, my lord.
In December of 1768, when you were talking in Parliament about denying petition from Pennsylvania concerning the right of taxation, you said, and I quote, "I think no line can ever be drawn. You must possess the whole of your authority or no part of it," end quote. Is that right?
That is true. Parliament must have supreme authority ultimately.
And it was your belief, as you also stated in Parliament, that the cause of the trouble with the colonies was, quote, "the false apprehensions on the part of the Americans of their rights," end quote. Is that right?
Indeed it is. They do not have the right to levy, to refuse payment of taxes.
Parliament passed an act that altered the charter of Massachusetts in 1774, did it not?
The authorities of Massachusetts refused to do their duty in maintaining order.
Can you answer that question, yes or no?
Therefore, Parliament passed a measure, temporary, to ensure that counsel in Massachusetts would be appointed by the governor in order that Counsel would not refuse the governor's requests to put troops in the streets of Boston when there was disorder.
By the end of 1774, you in Parliament were at total odds with the colonies. Is that right?
No, I don't accept that at all. There is no evidence whatsoever that we were at total odds with the colonies.
At the end of 1774, you sent to the king a detail of a plan for carrying on a war against America. Is that right?
I do not accept the implication of these, some of these questions, which is that the administration in London and Parliament in London was warring on all the colonies, or all the colonies. That is not the case. That was not the basis of our policy. And you are trying to put words into my mouth which totally misrepresent the political position in 1774 and the government's analysis of it. And I find this line of questioning totally unreasonable because it is not in any way, shape or form attempting to get near the truth. The fact is that we were dealing with a particular colony and a particular city, Boston and Massachusetts, with some discontent elsewhere, which created problems.
Excuse me.
There were large numbers of loyalists
Lord
in
North,
American colonies.
listen to the question and try to answer it.
You said total.
Did the King George III, tell you at the time he signed what's been called the Coercive Acts that the die is cast, the colonists must triumph or submit?
The point of the Coercive Acts was to ensure that the government of Massachusetts did its duty and that the people of Boston, the people of Boston,
could the witness be instructed to answer my question?
The people of Boston compensated the East India Company for the tea destroyed in Boston Harbor. Now, in that sense, the colonists must submit. But I totally reject the persistent line of questioning, which is completely wrong and makes a nonsense of the historical situation and the political situation, that all the colonists were regarded as in a state of rebellion.
Let's review some of the acts of Parliament that affected the rights of the Americans. By the end of 1775, the colonies' ability to trade, was totally restricted by Parliament. Is that right?
The colonists had boycotted British goods earlier in the decade, and I believe what we did in the late part of 1775 was to effect a sort of blockade in order to bring the colonists to their political senses.
Let's put it in perspective of what you've testified. You have tried to create in your testimony the position of a monarch in a parliament that was always willing to talk with the colonists, but you would not talk with the colonists as long as they were engaged in the acts of violence. Is that right?
That is correct.
And is it your position that you would not treat or enter into treaty negotiations with a colonist who was taking up arms against the king?
Well, you cannot have a treaty negotiation with somebody who's your own subject, subject of the king.
So you wouldn't recommend that?
Well, you can't.
You can't do it?
No.
It would be absolutely inconsistent for the government of Britain to enter into a treaty or to treat with the colonists who were bearing arms.
Well, you can't.
In 1778, Lord North, you made a speech to Parliament during which you proposed a peace treaty with the colonies. Is that right?
I'm trying to...
And I'll quote you on February 17th.
Find the reference.
Did you not authorize commissioners to treat for peace in 1978? I think it's right, isn't it? You sent Lord Carlisle.
Oh, indeed we did. And if I may just beg the court's indulgence, I might make just a few brief comments on that. Your lordships will appreciate that in any situation one has to consider the political circumstances, the changes in political life and development. And my lord, if I may be very brief then.
The war wasn't going very well then.
No, quite the contrary. The General Washington was in a terrible shape in the spring of 1770. But the key point, my lord, if I may come to it, without this heckling from Counsel over here, the key point, my lord, is this: the big change And the change which gave the colonists so much encouragement, lifted their crippled morale in the spring of 1778, was that the war had become an international conflict. And the colonists cravenly had allied themselves with the French, with the King of France. And that, my lord, is the reason why the government felt inclined to look at the whole situation in a very different way. We were engaged now in a major international war with the bitterest enemy of England and, my lord, previously of the colonists. So I beg your forgiveness for going on, but it is a rather important fact. We cannot discuss these issues in this rather puerile fashion, going from tiny quote to tiny quote.
In February of 1778...
Just a minute. May I put one question, which I hope you won't find puerile? If you had offered in 1774 or 1775 the terms you offered in 1778, do you think you'd ever have had a rebellion in the American colonies?
I very much regretted, and I have said this, I very much regretted some of the actions we took in the spring of 1774. Some of them, not all. And I suspect the answer to your question is yes.
Have you nearly finished, Counsel?
No, my lord.
You haven't nearly finished?
No, I'm through.
Oh, you have finished, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
May I ask you a question, Lord North? Have you ever been to America?
I have not, my lord.
Has any minister in your cabinet ever been to America?
I believe possibly one, my lord.
At one time, was there a proposal that a royal commission should visit the colonies and discover the temper of the people?
I cannot remember, my lord. I apologize.
I thought there had been such a proposal, but it had been vetoed by His Majesty. I thought you would know about that.
I was trying to be discreet, my lord.
Thank you.
I am His Majesty's minister.
Thank you, Lord North.
Call Thomas Jefferson.
Jefferson, please identify yourself for the record and give us your place of residence.
I'm Thomas Jefferson, Governor of the Commonwealth of Virginia. At present, I reside in the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg, Virginia.
Tell us briefly, sir, your experience in colonial matters.
Well, sir, most important, I was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses for 10 years before being elected governor.
Have you participated in the preparation of any document of note?
The Declaration of American Independence, sir.
Tell us, Governor, what the Declaration of Independence represents so far as the rights of the American colonists.
Sir, before I mention what I feel it represents in an honorable sense for the people of the world, I must mention that it represents the unsuccessful attempt, sir, to achieve and maintain the basic freedoms, sir, of the American people. I dare say of the English people, sir, living in the United States now, as well as others in the world. I say, sir, that the Declaration sets forth our grievances and our efforts to petition for the redress of those grievances, sir. I say, sir, that our Declaration states the basic facts, sir, mentioned originally in the Magna Carta of 1215, sir.
Do you have any doubt, Governor Jefferson, that the colonists, British citizens in America, were entitled to all the rights and privileges and liberties of Englishmen living within these islands?
No doubt whatever, sir. We were Englishmen residing in the colonies.
I ask if you can tell us what these are.
I'm happy to say, sir, that it gives me great pleasure to read here in my mother country the original charter of the colony of Virginia, 1606, and to see here, sir, the great patent of the New England Colonies, 1690.
What references, Governor Jefferson, are there in these patents which were granted by the King of England, both to Virginia, to New England, and thereafter to the other colonies, with regard to the rights of the inhabitants of those colonies?
The right to live as free men, sir, in the colonies. The right to the due process of law, sir, and I might add the right to effectively petition for the redress of our grievances.
During the period prior to 1776, what peaceful steps were taken, Governor, with regard to the grievances of the colonies, and were those attempts successful?
Sir, there were several attempts at petitioning the Parliament for redress of certain grievances. In most cases, sir, I'm afraid that those petitions were left unheard.
After 1775, was there a change in the political direction which the colonies took?
Sir, I'm afraid that we had been frustrated by our efforts to hear redress on several of our grievances, to hear answer from His Majesty and his Parliament, and therefore frustrated, sir, we set out on the brink of war to take up arms, sir, to defend ourselves per se.
Can you, sir, draw a parallel from recent English history to the acts of the American colonists?
Recent, sir, I would perhaps go even further than 100 years ago to the charges of treason brought against King Charles I.
And as a result of those charges?
As the result of those charges, sir, the king was tried for treason, found guilty, and beheaded.
Can you think, sir, of a parallel of even more recent date?
More recently, sir, to mind comes the Glorious Revolution, 1680, sir, and the resultant Bill of Rights of the English people.
I show you what has previously been marked for identification, and I ask if you can tell us what this is.
Indeed, sir, this is the Bill of Rights of 1688.
In drafting the Declaration of Independence, Governor Jefferson, did you draw from any historical precedents which had been accepted as the basic rights of all Englishmen, wherever they dwell?
Indeed, sir, I did. I mentioned the Magna Carta. I drew from the Magna Carta. From the charges of treason against King Charles I, I have drawn from that document, and the British Bill of Rights of 1688, and I would hope, sir, that they would attend to that themselves and read, as the people, that document, that I have also drawn from it.
Would you tell us the most important of the rights set forth in these precedents which you just told us about?
The right of peaceable assembly, the due process of law, trial by jury, the right of effective petition for the redress of grievances, and the right of quartering, the freedom of the right from quartering troops, sir.
In your opinion, were these rights denied to the colonists by George III prior to July 4th, 1776?
Yes, sir, in my opinion they were.
In what way?
Sir, they are, though not enumerated, they are mentioned in detail in my Declaration of Independence, and I speak for all the American people. But I shall cite a certain few of those acts and freedoms. They suspended our colonial legislature, our right to assemble. They suspended the New York legislature in 1767, the Massachusetts legislature in 1768, the Virginia House of Burgesses in 1769.
Do you believe that prior to 1776 there existed a compact between the king and his subjects for the king to abide by the law of the land and to uphold and protect the rights of his people wherever situate?
I do indeed, sir.
And where did that compact originate, Mr. Jefferson?
Sir, that compact, sir, I feel proud to say, existed from ancient times and perhaps was first put to paper in the Magna Carta of 1215.
Did George III breach this compact, sir?
Yes, sir, I believe he did.
And as a result?
As a result, sir, we have taken up arms to defend ourselves against the rights taken away.
As a practicing lawyer, you were familiar with the commentaries of Lord Blackstone on the Treason Act of 1351, are you not?
It has been some time, sir, since I was practicing law as a trial lawyer. However, sir, yes, I was familiar.
Section 3 of the Treason Act of 1351 is entitled Levying War Against the King in His Realm. Did Lord Blackstone draw any exceptions within his commentaries with regard to acts such as the acts committed by the colonists in America? And if so, please tell us.
In cases of natural oppression, the nation has very justifiably risen as one man to vindicate the original contract subsisting between the king and his people.
Has any member of Parliament, to your knowledge, concurred with the thought of Lord Blackstone in recent date?
Sir Edmund Burke wrote, and I quote, "It looks to me to be narrow and pedantic to apply the ordinary ideas of criminal justice to this great public contest. I do not know the method of drawing up an indictment against a whole people."
And do you, sir, consider the indictment today against George Washington as an indictment against an entire people, the Americans?
I do indeed, sir.
What options did we have, sir, in 1776?
Sir, we had two options. We must defend our liberties, or we must live in slavery where, sir, no person should exist.
Your witness.
Mr. Jefferson, you're aware of Magna Carta. Was not the basic liberty exacted by the barons from King John the right to be taxed only by Parliament?
That is correct, sir. That was the law of the land.
Yes. You have given the example of King Charles I. Was not the crime, if it was a crime of King Charles I, that he ruled without Parliament?
Sir, that is a matter to which I should give myself great debate.
Yes. Well, Mr. Jefferson, as you've said, King Charles I was executed for treason. Do you know what happened to those who executed him after the restoration of Parliament and the monarchy in 1660? The point is, Mr. Jefferson, that those who executed King Charles I were themselves executed for treason. You must be aware of that. You are. Does that not make your precedent a rather melancholy one, Mr. Jefferson?
Perhaps, sir, but then again, the oppression of the people over the years may indeed be termed so.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence is indeed an eloquent document. Does it truly state the moral foundations of your revolution?
Sir, I believe it speaks for the American people.
And for you, do you believe in it?
I do indeed, sir.
Do you believe, as you state there, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
I, sir, as well as those assembled in caucus, did believe that, sir, when we signed our name.
Are black slaves not men?
They are indeed, sir.
Do they have the right to liberty or the pursuit of happiness in your colonies?
Sir, some of them are free men, sir.
free men are not slaves. But as you mentioned free men, in your own state of Virginia, is it not the law that not even a freed Negro may ever qualify for the vote?
It is a subject to which we are attending at the moment, sir, under our new Commonwealth.
Do you know how many black slaves there are in your colonies?
Sir, there is no correct account of that.
No. Let me ask again, do they have the right to liberty?
No, sir, as a collective body, they do not.
No. You have quoted from Mr. Edmund Burke. You must also know by name and literary repute another Englishman, Dr. Samuel Johnson. You do?
Indeed, I do, sir.
He put a question recently. He said, how is it that we hear the loudest cries for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Can you answer that question, Mr. Jefferson?
I would say, sir, that is, as a people, sir, in the United States of America, they would be speaking as the rest of us were speaking.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, in your Declaration of Independence, you list a number of grievances against His Majesty, and one of them is that he has excited domestic insurrection among us. You recall that one?
It is correct, sir.
And what you had in mind was that the British government and the British Army offered freedom and weapons to all slaves who fought on the English side.
That is one of the references, sir.
Is that a wicked thing to have done?
Sir, considering the times, I do not think it helped the situation any.
Mr. Jefferson, I hate to be personal, but you have put your case on a high moral ground. Is it not the case that 22 of your own slaves have deserted to the British?
Sir, 22 of my slaves have not been heard from.
Very well, Mr. Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson, in the course of your Declaration of Independence, you make the point, or attempt to make the point, that taxes are imposed on you without your consent, presumably because you are not represented in Parliament in London. Is that right?
That is the general cry, sir.
Yeah. You, as a burgess of Massachusetts, and particularly as one who has been appointed, however illegally, to be governor of that colony of Virginia, you will know that in Virginia itself, only freeholders have the right to vote. And not every freeholder, only those with 25 acres and a house on it, or with 50 acres unimproved. Is that not something about which you yourself have complained in Virginia?
Indeed it is, sir.
Have you not said of your own colony of Virginia that the majority of the men in the state who pay and fight for the state's support are unrepresented in its assembly?
I have indeed, sir.
But your attempt to redress that met with failure in the Virginia Assembly, did it not?
It was met with contention, sir, in the Virginia Assembly.
And have the people of Virginia rebelled against their assembly?
Sir, the Assembly of Virginia was dissolved by His Majesty, sir.
And have you a present representative body in Virginia?
My present representative body, sir, in the Commonwealth of Virginia is at work on the issues that you bring up.
Very well. And if you fail on those issues, as you see them, would you regard yourself as having a right to rebel?
Sir, I would regard myself as having the right to petition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson.
Thank you, sir. Thank you to the people.
Called Benjamin Franklin.
Your name, sir?
Franklin, Philadelphia.
Given the hour, Mr. Franklin, I'm going to pass over many of the preliminaries. I'm sure the prosecution will stipulate that your life has been rich with experience. I understand, sir, that you have been a publisher and printer, an essayist and an author, a businessman and a musician, and a scientist and an inventor. Dr. Franklin, I would like to direct your attention just briefly to the year 1757. Can you tell us whether that year holds any significance whatsoever to you?
Well, yes, it was the first time I was sent to England, sir, by the Assembly of Pennsylvania.
Under what circumstances did they send you?
Well, they sent me, sir, to try and negotiate with the Penns as regarded the taxation of their properties and a few other matters, as I remember.
Then the better part of your time from 1757 through 1775 was in fact spent in this country and not in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, indeed, sir. I lived on Craven Street, sir, 36.
Can you describe your general activities on behalf of the colony?
Well, I was an agent, sir, of Pennsylvania.
Excuse me, Dr. Franklin. Before we go on, so everyone here knows what we're talking about, can you describe for us precisely what an agent, a colonial agent,
Well, a colonial agent, sir, was someone who was concerned with the affairs of a colony, and much of their effort was presenting petitions of the legislature to various ministers and members of government, the parliament, and the king himself.
Was that the nature of your engagement?
Yes, sir.
Now, you mentioned some negotiations, I believe, with the proprietors, and I believe, more importantly, rumors about taxation.
Yes.
I'd like to turn to that matter. What rumors?
Well, we had heard there was something to be had, which was finally, I believe, called the Stamp Act.
Were your efforts that were directed towards the Stamp Act successful or not?
Well, sir, they were successful. Of course, it wasn't old Ben alone, you understand. There were a good many people involved. But we did, sir, get a result. It was repealed.
Did that require testimony on your part before the House of Commons?
I had that privilege, sir.
Dr. Franklin, are you aware of a speech that was given by Charles Townshend to the House of Commons in which he promised to find revenue in America for its military establishments for the benefit of the land tax at home?
I believe I have heard of that, sir. Yeah.
What did you think of that?
It was a foolish thing to do, sir, for it but seemed to increase the ire of those in the colonies.
Those were duties on glass, lead, paper,
and silver,
paint, and tin. What did you do then?
Well, sir, I continued to speak with everyone I could possibly speak with. I continued to write letters, and I continued to publish as best I could, sir, in an attempt to reason with people as to the wrongness of these acts.
I assume you did that while the legislation was being considered?
Well, yes, sir.
And after it was approved?
Well, we continued in perhaps a slightly different vein.
Well, I assume that your efforts were unsuccessful as the legislation was indeed enacted.
Well, that's true, sir.
And notwithstanding that, did you still consider yourself an Englishman?
I have always considered myself, until recent years, sir, an Englishman.
And after that legislation was enacted by the government, can you tell this court whether you yourself, Mr. Franklin, Dr. Franklin, were for reconciliation and compromise with Great Britain or for independence?
Sir, I have been, in most all things in my life, for compromise. Always, sir.
You've heard testimony by others before us of the ministry of Lord North, did you not?
Yes.
Are you familiar with something known as the Coercive Acts?
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
Also known as the Intolerable Act.
Yes, sir.
That would be the Boston Port Act. Yes, sir?
Yes, sir, I've heard of that.
The Massachusetts Regulatory Act.
Yes, sir.
The Quartering Act.
Yes, sir.
You've said, Dr. Franklin, that you took petitions in the past, that you wrote, that you spoke, that you published. Did you do the same with respect to the Coercive Acts?
Yes, sir, everyone.
Did you take petitions to anyone who would listen to you?
Well, I did to some who would listen, sir, but they took them on and they were always given short shrift or they died in Parliament in discussion.
What was your objective in all of this, Dr. Franklin?
My objective, sir, was to reach a compromise. I have always wanted nothing more, sir, than a permanent union with Britain, but, sir, upon the condition of equal liberty.
Dr. Franklin, did there come a time that you left London and returned to the colony?
Yes, sir. I returned in 75, sir.
You became a delegate to what?
Constitutional Convention, sir.
And you signed what document?
Well, the Declaration of Independence, of course.
Thereafter, were you given additional responsibilities?
I was sent to France, sir.
For what purpose?
Try and arrange an alliance with that country to assist us in our battle with Britain.
With what result?
Success, sir. Last year we signed an alliance with France and they recognized us as an independent nation.
Dr. Franklin, let me ask you one concluding question.
Sure.
You who have invested so much time, so much effort over so many years, was there any way the conflict with Great Britain could have been avoided short of bloodshed?
Yes, sir.
How?
Compromise, sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Franklin, I have very few questions for you. I want to first, if I may, take you back to 3 instances in your early life, and then I will ask you a question about them. The first instance, these all occurred in your days in Pennsylvania during the 1740s and onwards, Dr. Franklin. The first instance was in 1747, when there was a French raiding party that sailed up the Delaware River, was 40 miles from Philadelphia, and the Colonial Assembly was so feeble that you had to organize your own independent militia and run a lottery to buy cannons. Is that right?
I think that's correct, sir.
The second instance in 1755, when the Indians were threatening the west of Pennsylvania, and you tried to have a militia bill pushed through the Pennsylvania Assembly, and you failed. Do you remember that?
I believe so, sir.
And the third instance is in 1763, the uprising of the Indian chief Pontiac. And on those occasions, the Pennsylvania Assembly was so dithering and impotent that militant whites banded together and formed a group called the Paxton Boys. Do you remember those Paxton Boys? The question that I wish to ask you about those 3 instances in your own life, Dr. Franklin, is this. Don't you think it was quite reasonable of the government in 1763 to form the view that for the proper defense of a state like Pennsylvania, you needed to have full-time professional troops posted in America?
That's a very good question, sir. Very good indeed.
What's the answer to it?
My lord, the answer is very simple. I should have had not such a great problem if we had been represented in Parliament and had a voice in voting it's being done, sir.
Can I ask you now about your time in London, Dr. Franklin? It would be fair to describe you as a sort of lobbyist, wouldn't it?
What, sir?
A sort of lobbyist.
Oh, that's a very interesting word.
You lobbied members of Parliament and you wrote pamphlets. You've told us about it already. You attended debates in the Houses of Parliament. You were consulted by the English government, as we've heard. You were consulted about the Stamp Act, that's right, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
And you were consulted about the Quartering Act, that's right, isn't it?
I was consulted but disagreed with, sir.
Now, you must have had a very close familiarity with the way that Parliament worked. Would you say that was fair?
Well, I tried very hard to, sir. But sometimes it took strange twists and turns.
Yes. It was all part of the process of negotiation and consultation, wasn't it, Dr. Franklin?
Within the membership, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Franklin. I've got no further questions.
Any questions? Thank you, Dr. Franklin.
Call George Washington. George Washington, would you hold the testament in your right hand and repeat after me these words? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
General Washington, you have been charged here before this honorable court with the charge of high treason, and your plea to that, General Washington, was not guilty. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
And why is your plea not guilty, General Washington?
Well, sir, I do not believe that I have committed treason against the crown. I believe, sir, that I have striven to protect the rights of English Americans.
Now let's go back in your lifetime, in your early service in the military. Would you briefly tell his lordships and the judges assembled your early military active service in Virginia?
Well, sir, I received a commission as a major in the militia.
Now, at that time, serving with the Virginia militia, were you aware of the rights and abilities of a member of the Virginia militia to have a commission, if any, in the British military?
Oh, sir, my own experience proves that it is impossible for a colonial officer to receive a commission in the regular British Army. I myself wished to have such a commission, and I was refused.
And what was your view at that time of your loyalty to the Crown?
Well, sir, I began to think, sir, that the British were not thinking about colonials as Englishmen, and my mind began to wander, sir. I began to wonder that perhaps someday there might be a separation between our two countries, but in my deepest concerns I thought that this might be put off and be answered in posterity. But then, sir, the matter of taxes were raised.
Why do you think the Crown imposed the taxes you've heard about discussed with Lord North?
Well, sir, I believe the Crown felt that they had made an investment in the colonies during the French and Indian War, and they wanted to get some of their money back.
And what was the Crown's response, General, to Benjamin Franklin's efforts to warn and plead for reduction and elimination of those taxes?
Well, obviously, Mr. Franklin was refuted. His pleas were refuted, and when we escalated the situation, the Crown turned and exacerbated the situation by being even more oppressive, sir.
Sir, what would you consider the fundamental issue that persuaded you to take up arms in defense of colonial rights as Englishmen following 1775?
You know, sir, all my young life I thought of myself as an Englishman. But as I grew older, I saw that this world was changing, and I began to think, why would I take up arms against the Crown? Perhaps it's just a misadministration, or perhaps George III is a bit petulant. But, sir, I began to see that the Parliament and the Crown were systematically developing a system that was to grind us down, was to push us to a position where we had no other alternative, sir, but to protect those rights which were ours with our own lives.
Now, General, you accepted on July 16, 1775, the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, did you not, sir?
Oh, yes, sir.
And now the first action, General, that you took in your new command as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army was what?
Well, sir, I went to Massachusetts, to Cambridge, where a ragtag group of marvelous, wonderful colonial patriots had surrounded the British, beaten them back into Boston. And I organized the officer corps, and we took the heights around Boston. I might point out, sir, that the British were strategically vulnerable, but I did not attack.
You didn't attack. Who fired the first shot, General?
Oh, sir, that's very difficult in war to say, sir, but the point is that I did not attack. When I had the opportunity to attack, my purpose was to allow the British command to consider what had happened, and perhaps the government at that time could curb what was going on, and we could find some line to draw reconciliation on.
Were you still looking at that time, General, for reconciliation?
Yes, indeed,
and compromise with the king?
Indeed, sir.
Is it true, General, that you come as a man of honor, an officer and a gentleman, as much to stand trial for your reputation against the charges of treason as to sue for peace?
I do indeed, sir. I commit no treason, sir. I only seek to regain the rights granted to us as Englishmen. But, sir, we are a different country now. But I commit no treason.
Mr. Kentridge, your witness, sir.
General Washington, I must make it clear that your gallantry and honor are not impugned by me. But nonetheless, I have some questions for you. Tell me, General, are you finding it easy to obtain volunteers for your army?
Ours is a volunteer army, sir, and sometimes gentlemen in the ranks volunteer not to be in the ranks, particularly when they are farmers, sir, and it is time for spring planting.
Yes, that then takes precedence over the fight for liberty.
With men who have families to raise, sir.
Yes. General, I have heard you quoted as having said that there is a systematic plan on the part of the British government to impose the shackles of slavery on your colonies. Is that your view?
Might I explain, sir? Yes, in truth it is. But I believe that the Crown placed itself in an economic position that the only place from which they could obtain revenues to continue their war against the French was from the colonies. And we were to bear the brunt of that, sir, and I felt that that was systematic.
You've heard Lord North say, and it was not challenged, that between 1760 and 1775 there were some 200,000 new settlers from Britain and Europe. Do you ask us to believe that they voluntarily came to America into a state of slavery?
I do, sir. I would ask you to recall, sir, that the conditions from which they left, certain types of persecution, unemployment, inability to purchase land and to settle families and to grow into people, was a condition that was less than the slavery they might encounter when they came to America.
Well, General, let us go to perhaps a more profound question. And that is what has been called in the Declaration of Independence and in this court as the right of a people to revolt against their government in certain circumstances. Now, General Washington, you are not fighting for the sake of war. You are fighting to establish an independent country. And presumably you look to the future when your colonies will become states in a federal union of states, and you'll be an independent republic. You look forward to that day?
That would be quite acceptable.
Yes. Do you visualize that a government so established would ever recognize the right of any section of its people to revolt against it?
I would hope, sir, that we would have provisions within our Constitution, if we should ever have one, that would allow grievances to be redressed so that no such armed revolt would be necessary.
Well, General, you are a far-sighted man, if I may say so. And I want you to look ahead into the future. Look ahead 75 years from now, or perhaps let me say 80 years from now. Assume that you have a strong union of many states.
The next thing you'll be saying, Mr. Kentridge, is he going to talk about flying to the moon, I suppose?
Well, my lord, I take it on the General's terms. You will establish, let us say, a great republic, not of 13 colonies, but perhaps of 20, 30 states, all bound by a constitution freely entered into. And let us assume that a section of your states felt within themselves a grievance and felt it as deeply as you feel your grievances. Let us assume, purely hypothetically, that the grievance which divides them is the issue of slavery. And let us suppose that a section of these states, feeling as deeply as they do about it, claim the right to secede from the Union. If at that time you were President of the United States, would you recognize their right of secession?
I cannot conceive that once a federal system has been set into motion, that one wouldn't strive mightily to preserve it.
Well, General, what I am putting to you is that any state, however constitutional, however democratic, however liberal, cannot recognize in any section of its people a right of secession, and that it is bound to go to war to preserve its unity. Will you not accept that?
No, sir, I do not accept that.
Well, General, I hope you are right in thinking that if ever the country which you may one day found is riven by a deep discord, I hope that you are right in thinking that your country will not go to war to preserve its union. But that question, sir, I leave to the judgment of history and the judgment of this court. Thank you, General.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, General. Now, Mr. Kentridge, you address us first.
My lords, in a civilized world, we all live in states, and some of us are lucky to live in a state with a constitution. And in every such state, there must surely be a supreme legislative power which we recognize. In this country, it is the king in parliament. And I submit, my lord, when one has a parliamentary system of this sort, no right to revolt can be recognized. My lord, as Blackstone said, there may be cases of what he called national oppression, where one might say the compact between sovereign and people, the imaginary compact, is breached. But what are the examples given, my lord? Every one of them, Magna Carta, Charles I, James II, where the monarch himself breached the Constitution by purporting to rule without Parliament. My lord, our gracious Majesty King George III has done nothing of that sort. He has not ruled save constitutionally through Parliament. One may ask, may Parliament oppress a people? I suppose, my lords, the answer must be yes, but the word is oppress. I said originally we know what oppression means. If we think back to the Netherlands in the 16th century under King Philip, that was what we mean by oppression. The religion of the people was suppressed, their institutions were all suppressed, they were executed and imprisoned without trial. Do we have anything of that sort here, my lord? I would submit no. The gallant general has said that the government of this country is set to reduce his to a position of slavery. Can that really be taken seriously, my lords? My Lord, the case which the defendants have sought to put up is a moral case. Their case,
Worse for that.
my Lord, if it were truly a moral case, it would be the better for it. But I must respectfully submit, my Lord, that the moral pretensions of their case are ill-founded. What is this slavery when hundreds of thousands of people cross the Atlantic to seek it? My Lord, what is the slavery which we see protested against when this is a country of slavery in the literal sense? My Lord, there is one right which Americans have which Englishmen do not have. In 1771, Lord Mansfield in Somerset's case said that the heir of England was not compatible with slavery, and any slave who set foot on English soil was automatically free. That law, my Lord, has not been imposed on the Americans, and they do not seek it. My Lords, what is then the morality of their case? My Lords, as I have said to General Washington himself, his gallantry is admired by all of us, and so is his sincerity. But the legal, political, and moral bases of his case, of his defense, are missing. And what I ask your lordships for in the circumstances is an unusual judgment. I ask your lordships not to convict General Washington of treason with the appalling consequences that must follow such a conviction. I ask your lordships simply to make a declaration that General Washington has been guilty of treason, and then that his sword be returned to him and that he be free to return to the colony from which he came here, in the hope, my Lord, that your lordship's judgment will cause him and those who misguidedly follow him seriously to reconsider their position.
Thank you, Mr. Kentridge.
My lords, learned counsel, we come here with a great deal of respect for this court, for the English people, and for the system of justice in England. Indeed, this case focuses on the right of a people to govern themselves. This isn't a new idea. This isn't an idea that we can lay claim to. We learned this idea from you. We are here to defend the claim of treason because our right as a people to govern ourselves has been interfered with and taken away from us by Parliament and the King. England, through its history, has struggled and has spilled blood to establish the right that the people of England can be represented in Parliament by people that they choose. So too, we the American people have a right to govern ourselves by people we choose, not by a parliament chosen by people on an island several thousand miles away. This is not a quarrel over how much the Stamp Act tax is or whether it was justified or not. It's a quarrel over the right of a government that is not derived from our consent to impose that kind of legislation on us. Taxes have been imposed on us, our property taken away without our consent or the consent of anybody we've chosen to represent us. Our ports have been blockaded. Our right to trial by jury has been trampled upon. Our charters have been amended without our consent. And by the end of 1774 and in 1775, we were declared, in essence, to be rebels and outside of the protection of the realm. Our royal governors fled our country and in every real sense of the word have abdicated any authority they might otherwise have. We have a right to govern ourselves. It is by exercising that right that we have offended and gotten in trouble with the Parliament and the Crown. When the Crown and Parliament have decided to subdue us, to force us to submit by force and violence, which they have done, we have a right to defend ourselves and to resist those acts of tyranny. We had no choice but to either defend ourselves or submit to the whim of a government whose legitimacy was not derived by our consent. The English people haven't done that in their history, nor should we.
We are very grateful to Counsel. The Court will now adjourn to consider its verdict.
Well, that's the case. You've heard the evidence. Was General Washington guilty of treason or not? The tribunal has considered its verdict and is about to return to court.
The prisoner, the defendant, I should say, at the bar of this court, faces an indictment which charges him with treason. The primary facts alleged are beyond dispute. There is no issue but that the general accepted command of the colonial armies which are currently engaged in a warlike conflict with the forces of His Majesty. Indeed, the general's been very successful. Only in 1977, he forced the surrender of General Burgoyne's army at Saratoga. How then does the matter stand as a question of law? It seems to be common ground between counsel on both sides that there may be some circumstances in which such actions as those in which the general has engaged may be justified. The essence of the defense is that it is eventually justified in resisting intolerable oppression by the imperial government in Westminster. Is it really to be said, in the words of Lord North, that General Washington was a minority rabble-rouser, an agitator engaged in some private plot of his own, some treasonable plot to subvert the authority of the crown? Or is the true position is that he was a soldier who accepted his role as commander-in-chief of the colonial forces in response to a spontaneous reaction on the part of the colonists to the way they had been treated by the imperial government at Westminster? Are we really to suppose that hitherto law-abiding and peaceable citizens suddenly turned criminal overnight? The truth of the matter is that even at a very late stage in the deteriorating relations between the colonies and Her Majesty's government in London, the colonists showed their extreme anxiety not to sever their link of loyalty with the crown. It was only in the last resort that they were driven to a declaration of independence. Now, it seems to be that the inescapable logic of this situation is that if we are to declare General Washington a traitor, and even though we are not asked to send him to the gallows, we are bound to say that so also ought 2 million of his fellow colonists. There are, I believe, no precisely defined rules of law which dictate the result when what the court faces is a spontaneous uprising by a colonial community and which is prompted by what that community feels to be intolerable oppression. Now, if there is one principle in the criminal law which I think we can apply, is that any criminal conduct is to be judged not necessarily upon the facts as they are, but in the light of the facts as they appear to the defendant on reasonable grounds. If a defendant upon reasonable grounds believes that he is being attacked by another, then he is entitled to defend himself. If a community on reasonable grounds believes that it is being intolerably oppressed by a government 3,000 miles away across the ocean, and I would hold that the law declares that he is entitled to revolt against that oppression. Accordingly, I reach the conclusion that the Crown should be denied the declaration which they seek. We are to declare General Washington a free man.
Thank you, my lord.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.